warm welcome to our studio guests today and to fellow travelers out in cyberspace, thanks to that non-stop stream of zeros and ones. My name is Peter Gobets, co-founder of the Zero Project and moderator of the International Conference-cum-Workshop on Zero. Zero Project is a three-stage affair. It's a book project, an associated online event, and the in-depth research to follow. But today, session number 17, and we welcome two co-organizers of the online event and co-directors of the Amir Dxl Foundation, Mrs. Debra Aczel and her daughter, Dr. Miriam Aczel. They will share with us some insights into the late Professor Aczel's untiring pursuit of the lost Cambodian zero, and their commendable work in support of Cambodian mathematics education. Professor Aczel's singular quest was and still is an inspiration to the Zero Project, which can be seen as a continuation of the overarching objective to shed light on the invention of zero. For those not acquainted with Professor Aczel's work, we have compiled a brief excerpt of him in his Google presentation a few years ago.
They told me if it exists, then maybe it's here, but they may have destroyed it. So there it is, I found it. So it took a while, maybe half a day, going through, and I finally found it. This is K127 is what CEDES, the number CEDES gave it. This is from behind, and this is from the front. And here are two pictures of the front of this stele. And the zero is dead center on the right photograph. Right there. And this is what it says. It says the Saka 605 year began on the 5th day of the waning moon. And 605 are these. This is better. So you can see the zero is the dot. So why is it a dot? A zero discovered sometime later in Indonesia is a year younger than this one. So this is the oldest zero we know. And apparently the Khmer Rouge didn't think it was important. That's why it survived destruction. There is damage to it, but maybe it was the Khmer Rouge. I have no idea, but not the part that's important. You can see the damage on the last slide, on the top there. We don't know whether this damage was done by the Khmer. It doesn't look like a statue, so they wouldn't have wanted to destroy it necessarily. But it does have damage on the top and on the side here. And you can see the zero on the second line from the bottom. So why is it a dot? The other zero from Indonesia, which is... so I need to explain the dating, though. So Saka began in 78 AD. And this is the year 605 of the Saka era. And so 605 plus 78 is 683, which is a prime number, by the way. So 683 is the date, and therefore it's 2 centuries earlier than Gwalior, and there was no extensive Arab trade at the time, and this is further east. So that is very strong proof of the hypothesis that the zero is indeed an Eastern invention.
It's an impressive excerpt to be introduced to Professor Amir Dxl in this way, and we'll revert to that. But our other studio guests today are Dr. Marina Wil, a close friend of the Aczel's family, Dr. Solang Uk, who translated the book Finding Zero into the Khmer language, and none other than the award-winning documentary maker and co-producer of the popular TV series Closer to Truth, Mr. Peter Gzels. Dear ladies, we have invited you to proceed with this talk and been looking greatly forward to this moment. So please go ahead.
Peter, thank you so much. It's really a tremendous honor for both of us to be part of this ongoing series of talks on zero and have the opportunity to really emphasize the importance of Cambodia and the history of mathematics, and of course to tell the story of the late Dr. Amir Dxl, mathematician, writer of popular science and math stories, great lover of adventure. We want to tell you about Amir's search for the origins of numbers. That was for him a very personal story, and most importantly, the search for the first physical representation of zero. Kevin, could we have the first slide, please? On the right of this slide, that's the cover for his book that he wrote that details this story, and on the left is it's a graphic illustration that was published, that I think Miriam and I both love, that was published in Brazil, showing Amir as an Indiana Jones character. I don't think the Brazilians realized that often when Amir went into the field, he wore a hat just like that. And if you can see, his hand is grabbing the famous stele 127 with the zero. So Miriam, do you want to talk a little bit about how Amir got interested in this story, something of his background?
Yeah, of course. First of all, just to echo what you said, it's a real pleasure to be here, and I think especially to see just the diversity in talks. And it still doesn't cease to amaze me that we can connect people from halfway across the country and be able to spend this time together. So I'm really, really grateful to be here. So yeah, I'll start at the beginning because I think that's how my father told the story in his book, Finding Zero. His father, my grandfather, was the captain of an Israeli cruise ship in the 1950s and 60s. And my dad spent vacations and as much time as he could traveling with his family on the ship. And one of his favorite routes was from the port of Haifa to the Côte d'Azur, so Marseille, Nice, and Monaco. And one of his earliest memories, and really life-changing one, was his father's steward sneaking him onto this famous Casino de Monte Carlo. And he must have been 5 or 6, and he was mesmerized by watching the roulette wheel with numbers and people screaming around the table, and depending on where small ball landed. So this is what he said led, this early experience led him to study math when he went to the University of California, Berkeley, which is where I happen to be right now. And that led to his career as a professor of probability theory. And then he wrote textbooks on probability. He had a real knack for communicating complicated things in an accessible way, and really getting people interested in math and science and kind of piquing curiosity. And then he continued to write popular science books on really whatever piqued his curiosity. So he wrote about Fermat's last theorem. He wrote about mysticism and Descartes' mathematics. He wrote about infinity and Kabbalah, origins of the compass, Foucault's pendulum, and probability of life outside the Earth. And one of my favorites was he wrote a book about CERN and the search for the Higgs boson. And one of my fondest memories is going with him to CERN. And he really, everything was kind of in terms of topics, everything was fair game. And I think he was really passionate about both exciting people about science and the beauty of science and mathematics through both exploration and mysteries and telling stories. And I think that's where it really gets back to the power of the zero story. So his final book, Finding Zero, is by far his most personal book. And it tells why he started this quest, what got him inspired in math and in science, and the unexpected things that he found.
And now I'd like to talk a little bit about how he undertook this search. And as he started looking more and more as a mathematician at the origins of numbers, he at the same time was reading more and more about potential relationship between philosophy, Eastern philosophy and culture, and the development of science and mathematics in the East. And he gradually became convinced that the numerals, as we use them in modern mathematics, must have had their origin in India. So he decided that he would go to India and find the origins of the numeral 0 to see what he could discover on the ground. I think what he believed was that mathematics held the key to all knowledge and was the highest form of art, was the highest form of spirituality. And he often said that he thought numbers existed in a pure state, I guess a Platonic state. And for example, he talks a lot about numeral 0 as being the symbol, the physical representation of what he described as the state of oneness, or 2, the state of two-ness, the idea that oneness and two-ness existed outside of human consciousness, outside of mathematics, but somehow in the universe. And this concept, I think really fascinated him. And he spent a lot of time asking other mathematicians and philosophers how they viewed numbers in a not only a mathematical sense, but a philosophical sense. And I think that of all the numbers, he believed that 0 was the most perfect. So his quest really was to learn what he could about how humans developed and ultimately expanded the use of 0, what the potential trade routes or other paths were that led 0 to spread over the world. And perhaps what culture or cultures gave rise to it at its origin. So I guess his question was really, where did it begin and how was it spread? So he went to India. And his purpose initially was to meet a mathematician he had met by chance at a conference in Australia, who had told him a couple of years before this, you must set this record straight, overturn the colonial bigotry that says mathematical origins are in the West. The source of all mathematics is here in India. And that intrigued him tremendously. And I think that sent him off to talk to this mathematician, to talk to other mathematicians and see what he could find of physical representations of 0 in India. So he first went, as part of his trip, he went to Khajuraho, where he was actually going in search of a mysterious magic square that a Japanese mathematician named Takao Hayashi had taken pictures of a couple of decades before. And the magic square was mysteriously inscribed in the entrance to a Jain temple in Khajuraho. So he went looking for this, and while he was there, he spent a good amount of time talking to experts in this temple complex about the potential relationship between Jain philosophy and numbers and 0. And then after that, he went to Gwalior to see the Sanskrit inscription that was the oldest definitively dated 0 at the time, dated to 876 of the Common Era. Well, Amir obviously knew about the Bakhshali manuscript and had seen it at Oxford at Bodleian, but it had not yet been allowed to be carbon dated. And he actually writes about it in his book that the Bodleian was very protective of it and refused to allow it to be sampled for the carbon dating. And actually, I think that if Amir were still with us, I think he would be quite interested in the whole controversy around the carbon dating of the manuscript, as in earlier iterations of his career as a statistician, he had written papers on the statistics behind carbon and other dating techniques. So now, I think that Amir was interested in physical proof, tangible evidence of how numbers developed. So he wanted to see the environments that produce numbers, the landscape, the culture, the temples, the sculpture, and meet the people who were the inheritors of multiple religious and philosophical traditions. Not only scholars in the field, not only experts, but also people living these traditions. So, and I guess I should say that he wrote all of his books this way. He went to CERN to meet physicists. He followed Descartes and Foucault's footsteps through Paris. He followed Einstein in Berlin. He went to famous Dragon Bone Hill in China to learn about the discovery of Peking Man. And I think he really believed that to understand the story, you had to see it on the ground. So then a bit serendipitously, he called a number theorist at University of British Columbia named Professor Bill Castleman, who by the way spoke when we had our conference a couple of years ago in Cambodia, to see if he could find out more information about the Gwalior Zero and find out what Bill Castleman thought about it. And what I gathered was that he didn't learn too much that he didn't already know about the Gwalior Zero, but in the course of the conversation, Bill told Amir that actually there was an earlier zero on a stone inscription that had been translated and written about by a French epigraphist and linguist named Georges Sidès. And by the way, Sidès is referenced in George Ifra's book on the history of numbers, and I think Amir knew very well the Ifra book, but was a little embarrassed that he had to be reminded of this by his conversation with Bill Castleman. So now the slide number 2 shows on the left-hand side, there are marks that show a lot of where inscriptions were found in the Samba region. On the right-hand side, the river running through. These identify where inscriptions were found and were cataloged by this French scholar Georges Sidès. And on the right-hand side is a photo of the site where the zero that we're here interested in was actually discovered. And as you can see from the image, there's no temple that remains there. There were some, even at the time that this stone was discovered, there was really very, very little that of substance there. So now our story shifts from India to Cambodia. Amir decided that he wanted to go discovering more about the Georges Sidès story. So there's a man named Admar Leclerc who held various positions in French colonial Cambodia, Indochine, who was also keenly interested in archaeology. And back in 1891, he had found 2 inscriptions in the ruins of the temple Trapang Pret at Sambaran Mekong that is marked. I don't know if you can actually find the number, but there is a K127 that's marked, K127 and 128 marked on this map. And Georges Sidès developed a numbering system for these inscriptions as he cataloged them. And using always the K as the first number, and then the letter, and then the numbers. So Kevin, could we have slide 3, please? Miriam, do you want to talk about what you're seeing here is a rubbing of K127 on the left-hand side, done under Georges Sidès. In the early part of the 20th century, and on the right, the 2 inscriptions. The one on the left is the inscription showing the zero that you also saw in the short little video that Amir gave of his talk at Google, with the zero represented as a dot in the middle, and on the right, it's a inscription from Sumatra that's closely, a bit later, but closely the same period, that displays the dot, instead of a dot for representing the 0, it shows a small circle in the middle.
Right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the story of Georges Sidès, because it's just remarkable. So in his early 20s, he spent time haunting the galleries in the Louvre, and he was really fascinated by the inscriptions in the antiquities display. So he started teaching himself ancient Khmer, and he then studied Sanskrit formally and also ancient Khmer. And eventually he got his doctorate at the École pratique des hautes études, and he got a job at the École française d'Extrême-Orient, initially in Hanoi. And then he went on to become a leading archaeologist, a linguist, and a historian of Khmer studies. And so Sidés's research and contribution to what we know about Angkor and pre-Angkor civilization is really, really important. So as one example, he wrote a book on Angkor Wat that's still considered today the most comprehensive study done to date. And he cataloged and translated around 1,000 inscriptions that are included in a massive 8-volume work. And his name is still prominent in the displays at the National Museum of Cambodia in Phnom Penh. So among scholars in the 1920s and 30s, numbers were frequently thought to have originated in the West, in Arabia or Greece, and passed through trade routes to India later. But through Sidés's extensive research and his study of Eastern civilizations, had convinced him that numbers in fact came from India, or perhaps what he called an Indianized civilization. So meaning other areas heavily influenced in culture, religion, and philosophy by India before they appeared in the Middle Ages in the West. And he thought that he could prove this origin definitively if he could find an inscription with a 0 that predated the Gwalior. So at the time, GRK was a well-respected scholar who was the first to do research on the Bakhshali, and concluding based on linguistic evaluation that it wasn't earlier than around 9th or 10th century. And he knew India well and had studied Sanskrit documents that he called unreliable because he felt that they could be copies or they could have been falsified or had other problems. And he really strongly supported the view that numbers came from the West and certainly not India. And so Sidés was determined to prove him wrong once and for all, and thought that documents wouldn't be enough because, Kay didn't trust them. So he needed a really irrefutable piece of proof, a stone inscription. So as Sidés began translating K127 from Old Khmer, he was stunned to realize that it had a date that had a 0, and further that the date that was proof that he was looking for. So it was, as you can see on the slide there, 605 of the Saka era, or 683 CE. And so this is a full 2 centuries earlier than Gwalior 0. So that's the proof. And then, of course, Kay tried to argue that this is not proof since it's just one single inscription. But then another inscription was found of around the same date, just a little bit younger in Sumatra. And in terms of what K127 says, it reads like a ledger. It's a bill of sale, and it has references to 5 pairs of oxen, to slaves, and sacks of white rice. And so that's why we know that the number is contained there.
Kevin, could we have the next slide, please? So what I'm showing here is just a very, very abbreviated and excerpt from a timeline that shows where K127 fits. So you see the Brahmagupta that's earlier. You see that the famous mathematicians, the Arab mathematicians, are later. Now, the story of discovery of K127 is really quite stunning and marked a major change in the bias against the idea of mathematical development coming from the East to the West rather than the other way around. But Amir felt very strongly that Cambodia's role in this history was not well known. Now, during the murderous rule of Cambodia by the Khmer Rouge is well known, and the legacy has left deep scars in Cambodia. The Khmer Rouge sought to destroy the intellectual class, to destroy art, culture, history. In fact, when they took over political power in 1975, they declared year zero, signaling a new beginning to Cambodian history, an erasure of all previous Cambodian history. As Amir began searching for the stone Sedesse called K127, he learned that it had disappeared. It had been in the National Museum, but was no longer there. People he spoke with thought it had likely been destroyed by the Khmer Rouge, who smashed artifacts, something like 1,000 artifacts throughout Cambodia. Amir was aided in his search by many, many people in Cambodia, and I think viewed his work very much as the result of collaborations. He finally, through a colleague who had a friend, who had a friend, who had a friend, was put in contact with the head of something called Angkor Conservation, located in Siem Reap, a kind of storehouse for antiquities, many of them broken or severely damaged from the time of the Khmer Rouge. The director there said yes, in fact, K127 had been brought there in 1969, but it was not clear if the stone was still there. And to look further, he would need permission from the Ministry of Culture. This led eventually Amir to the most important contact with His Excellency Habtush, former director of the National Museum in Phnom Penh, and now in charge of all cultural artifacts in Cambodia. In fact, His Excellency spends considerable time reclaiming Cambodian artifacts from museums around the world to ensure his people of the legacy that has been stolen from them in so many ways. Amir eventually got permission he needed and headed back to Angkor Conservation. The director opened the door to one of several sheds, but a huge storage facility with Buddha heads and other parts lined up in rows and rows of stones bearing various inscriptions, and was essentially told, go at it. You're welcome to go look for it. We have no idea if it's here. If it's not, we don't know what you're looking for. So without much real hope of success, he began the search with just the old illustration in George Sedesse's catalog to guide him. And the stone, because it had apparently broken, even at the time that it was cataloged by Sedesse, it had a distinctive shape. So rather remarkably and stunningly, Amir recognized the shape from the old stone rubbing. There it was. And aside from the broken section at the top right side, this 7th century stone was in amazingly good condition, and the date containing the 0 was absolutely legible. Can we have the next slide, please? And there's Amir in Angkor Conservation, and there is the stone, and you can see its broken shape, and you can see the circle and the enlargement of the date. So, Miriam, do you want to talk about what happened next?
Yes, and can we get the next slide, please? Oh, great, thank you. So my dad was, not at all finished with the story when he died in 2016, and he wanted to continue looking at the relationship between culture and philosophy and religion and mathematics. And he also wasn't finished with Cambodia. He wanted to rescue K127 from the storehouse, and he wanted to see it installed in the beautiful museum in Phnom Penh. And His Excellency Habtush agreed that it should be there. So, and he also had plans for a conference on zero and the history of mathematics. He wanted, a huge conference. He wanted to bring the world's great mathematicians to work together to Cambodia and learn this incredible story. And he felt that the two projects could be his gift to Cambodia, and particularly to help the youth of Cambodia, who he really hoped to see excited and proud of this Cambodian contribution to the history of math. But before he was able to put into place these two plans, he passed away. So we set up a foundation in his name, the Amir Dxl Foundation. And our goal is supporting research and education in science and mathematics, and kind of beyond that as well, and arts and culture, but with an emphasis on Cambodia. And so with help from His Excellency Habtush and the National Museum in Phnom Penh, we supported the installation of the stone in a beautiful new room, which was inaugurated in 2019. And we had, help from a lot of friends, and we're really, really grateful for, for all of the support and for being able to have made, his dream come true. So these, you can see our pictures from the inauguration at the museum. And if we could get the next slide, please. Thank you. So this was our symposium. This was the second one of his plans. We had a symposium on the history of zero. And so we're grateful for support from Cambodia's Ministries of Culture and Education. And together with the Royal University of Phnom Penh's Department of Mathematics, we ran a conference that brought together mathematicians and historians of mathematics from India, Australia, France, Canada, and the US to share ideas with Cambodians. So we had Professor Kim Plucker spoke about her work on Indian mathematics and talked about her recent paper on concerns with how the Bakhshali manuscripts had been dated. And I think what was so amazing about it was to see so many young Cambodian math students attending our opening session. We had 500 first-year Cambodian students, and also to see how strongly the event was supported by the university and by the ministries, and really to see the number of young women in math. It was really, it was incredible to see all of these students really, really excited. And we're incredibly grateful to Dr. Solong Uk, who helped us enormously every single step along the way, from translating Finding Zero into Khmer and helping us arrange publication to make the book available at a low cost to Cambodians. And we're deeply honored to be part of this current workshop because we believe that the Khmer Zero is a really important part of the history of zero, and it needs to be better understood and celebrated. So we're now working with the Center for Khmer Studies to support a visiting researcher with interest in the Khmer Zero and mathematics. And we're open to the approach. We're interested in ideas that are cross-cutting, whether it's archaeology, religion, philosophy, cultural context, what happened after the early zeros discovery. So, for example, His Excellency Habtush told my father that the pre-Anchor was an Indianized civilization, but then leading up to the development of Anchor civilization, the culture changed and the use of numbers changed as well. And so we also have plans for a workshop in Cambodia for researchers to share ideas on the zero. So hopefully in 2023. And yeah, I think as we know from this range of talks that we've been listening to over the last few months, there's a lot more work to be done about zero, and celebrating the idea, it's learning about its cultural context, and we think that Cambodia is a really important piece of the puzzle.
And I guess we would like to conclude that listening to the series of talks over the last few months, I know that one of the questions that comes up has to do with the nature of the zero. Is it discovered? Is it invented? And Amir wrote an article not long after his experience in Cambodia, that for Smithsonian Magazine in the United States, that I think relates to that question and gives, I think, a very, very strong response in his own words. And he said, I quote, "Since that fortuitous moment, I've pondered the feat that brought us numerals, this time wondering not where and when, but how. I've asked dozens of mathematicians a long debated questions. Were numbers discovered or invented? The majority view is that numbers exist outside of the human mind. Unlike Beethoven's Symphony No. 9, they don't require a human creator. What gave numbers their power was the very act of naming them and writing them down." And with that, we just very, very much like to thank all the wonderful people who helped Amir with his search, and who are continuing to help us as we continue this pursuit. Thank you so much.
That was very enlightening to hear your story. I'd read the book, and this is the background around it. I never had the privilege of meeting Amir Dxl myself, but as I said in my introduction, also always an inspiration to read about somebody else who was that intensely into a subject. As our chairperson commented at the opening, that would take him so far afield in pursuit of that ideal. It's the same thrust that motivates us in doing this. In reading about zero, everyone praised it, glorified the invention of zero, and to our great chagrin, when we wanted to find out more details, it turns out that despite these accolades, no one bothered to do any research, and nobody even suggested that research could be done to find out how this greatest of innovations came to be, as you say, not just when or where, but also how and why. And we also look beyond mathematics, because mathematics does not itself evolve in a vacuum. It's part of a cultural context. And if it's not clear from within the field itself how it was invented after tens of thousands of years of people counting and doing mathematics, why would it suddenly pop up in the historical record? So we looked at a layer deeper to philosophy and linguistics, and the whole thrust of the Zero Project right now is to home in more on this focus as we go along. And I'm happy to divulge that we seem to be getting somewhere. So that's exciting. So thank you very much for taking the time and the interest you've shown, the support for the Zero Project. And we hope to collaborate further in the future as we go along. But we would like
thank you so much. Thank you. This is we really are quite honored to be part of this.
Well, it's absolutely mutual. So thank you very much. We have, as were introduced in the beginning, the special guests, and they've waited patiently. They know much of this because they were personally there. That's why we invited them. But Marina, may I ask you, after all that you have known and experienced yourself firsthand, are there any comments or questions that you may have for Debra and Miriam?
Well, first, I want to say that I feel extremely privileged to have been part of this adventure. For me, it was a mind-boggling discovery of a new world, and I mean, new for me, of course, and having also Sorang explain it to me. I mean, it was amazing, and it's an amazing project. I really look forward to continuing it after the pandemic. So about, I'll make a few comments first. So as you saw, this conference was both history of math and supporting Cambodian mathematicians. And so one question is, Cambodia is still very much reeling from its tragic recent history. So what is the best way to help all these young students whose picture we saw? And I think this combination of math and history of math is very interesting, because in the West we teach math, and maybe once we have a class about history of math, but that's all. So one wonders, with history of math, would it be a way to help the Cambodian math students, maybe by doing projects? Or so that's my first question. And my second comment is about numbers, and this. Although I spend lots of time talking with Amir, I'm not sure we ever discussed numbers. I was very interesting to discover today his idea of and view of numbers. And so maybe I'll quote to go along with what he said, something I said last week to my students, to my undergraduate students. I think numbers are the real, in a sense, the first mathematical object, in that mathematical objects they describe, they're an abstraction, they describe various situations, but by taking some abstract common property. For example, I was talking about to my students about the fact that if you take 3 letters ABC and you take all the permutations of these 3 letters, and if you take a an equilateral triangle in the plane, and you look at all the ways to transform it into itself, you actually get the same object. And so I was saying to them, you see, it's so that's notion of groups, no matter here, but groups are an object, a mathematical object, which it took much longer than numbers to invent / discover, which is about structures. But I said to him, you see, to them, you see, it's like numbers. You have 3 ideas, and you have 3 countries, Holland, France, and Italy, and it's the same number 3, and you're talking about vastly different things. And I think that's what mathematics is about in general, taking different things and looking at the one structure which they have in common, and then forgetting the trappings, the things you're talking about, to just focus on that structure. That's all I wanted to say.
Thank you, Marina. Debra, Miriam, any response?
Miriam, do you want to go first, or do you want me to go first?
You can go first.
Okay. I'll try to answer Marina's question. It's a really complicated question. It's not an easy one, what to do about Cambodian mathematics. I think one of the things that we learned was that, well, there's a great need for mathematics education, and the mathematician who we worked with at the Royal University told us that one of the issues students don't realize what they can do with mathematics other than become math teachers. So doing things that we think of professions that use mathematics are not as well known in Cambodia. So there's that. That's at a very practical level. How to inspire students to formally study mathematics, to do things, whether it's the newly developing insurance industry or Miriam is an environmentalist and interested in energy issues, applications in that field. So it's really it's applications. And then I guess the second piece of my answer to that question is about how history of mathematics can fit with that. And I think to realize that that there's something that your heritage has to do with a very important discovery mathematically, I think that's something to be really proud of. And if that can excite people, and I think Amir thought that to get young people interested in mathematics, a way of doing that was through the telling of stories. And these stories should be stories that reflect who you are. And one of the speakers that we had in Cambodia was an historian of mathematics who tells stories, but his stories are about white Europeans and discoveries that don't reflect necessarily the Cambodian audience. You need to see yourself in these stories. And so one of the things that we're sort of beginning to think about what we can do with with this organization in Cambodia. And one of the ideas that they had, in addition to doing a workshop, everything happens slowly, and right now things are really slow. But one idea is to do a workshop and bring in young people, possibly Cambodians, possibly with French and American students as well, to work on some sort of project that relates to history of mathematics, specifically the zero, that could have as an outcome an art project or a video, not necessarily just an academic paper. And the whole idea is to make people think that this is cool. This is really cool stuff. And I think that Amir thought math was just plain old cool and fun, and wanted everybody in the whole world to think math was just the greatest adventure there could possibly be. Miriam, anything?
Yeah, I think a couple of to sort of, to add on to that, I think that this idea of the zero is sort of transcending disciplinary boundaries and being both, cultural and historical and related to math, I think applies in sort of the notion of the concept of zero as well. And I think that there's another type of zero, which is for our conference, we made it a goal of getting as close to zero waste as possible. And of course, this is always a lot harder than planned. And I think this was something we had an incredible amount of support, and we're really grateful for that. But I think that we still found it challenging in terms of trying to reduce. And some of the solutions were, for catering, we had food served on banana leaves, and there were a lot of really interesting and kind of innovative ways of, nature-based solutions, ways of reducing waste. And I think that that's kind of another opportunity of math. To me, I think that that every country is grappling with environmental degradation and plastic pollution, and I think that there's a really important need for the sort of strengthening the connection between our natural world and our environment, and math as a tool for building more sustainable energy futures, environmentally durable futures, reforestation. And I think that is kind of a third aspect. And in terms of we sort of grappled with, neither of us are mathematicians, and how do we kind of continue this, my dad's legacy, and really keep alive what he inspired, this passion in us, and how do we find a way to kind of make it our own? And I think that in that sense, learning about environmental issues in Cambodia and kind of learning more about the country through the eyes of these young students was really just an incredible experience. And I think we're looking forward to continuing to work with them and other organizations and kind of taking wider perspectives towards zero and the history of math, and kind of continuing this legacy of inspiring passion and in math and in science.
Thank you, Marina. Does that answer your questions? Any?
Absolutely, yeah, and it gets me really excited about the future.
Just as you spoke, and I sort of tried to distill from both of your talks that what opportunities may lay ahead in connecting zero to other fields and also to the economy, because these young people will have to earn a living. I see a comment here. Could we get slide 2, please? Kevin, slide 2.
Oh no! This is yeah.
So what I was getting at is that this being the IT digital age, and it being totally 0 and 1, and totally mathematics, and totally coding and everything to do with that, it would be a great future for young people, especially, to get into a more mathematically based development in the IT sector. Possibly through outsourcing. If they're as good as some of the other countries are turning out to be, then programming can be outsourced to them. They can have a source of income. But that's going beyond where we are now. You're taking zero as a symbol more for other aspects. Zero pollution. We have our fellow trustee of the Zero Project, Mr. Rubinder Sachdev, who runs a company who's totally based on innovation and these kind of ideas. And he suggested the same thing, zero pollution, zero violence, world peace, everything looms on the horizon once you get into, because zero is really an axial concept. You have the number zero in mathematics, but it's an actual concept in all disciplines, as we're finding. We're running a little bit late. So long, please. You've waited patiently in the wings. This is your chance. You were there on the ground floor with all of this. Any comments or additions?
No, it's just very interesting talk, and I always respect Debra and Miriam, as well as the late Amir Dxl. That's all I can say. Well, as far as the math education in Cambodia, I've been away from the country for more than 50 years, so I cannot see what excuse me, what is the young people thinking. So, but I think the only thing I can guess is at the moment is their preoccupation, is to be able to find a job with some mathematical background to make a living for their family. That's all I can say.
Okay, thank you so long. And from my side, I would like to thank you for all you have done to make the work of Amir Dxl more productive and helpful, also to the ladies in organizing the conference, everything. You've done a tremendous job, and you've added also to the conference in your own way. So thank you from our side. And then we'll bring in Peter Gazelles, who has a special interest in this particular session. So he needs no introduction, but I'll introduce him anyway. I did, I think, at the beginning, co-producer of the Closer to Truth series, which has been very, very popular the last 20 years. I had to think of when the ladies were speaking about your and Robert Kuhn's interest in this very question of mathematics being discovered or invented. It's an issue that has not been settled. We have from the Zero Project and the philosophical probably groundings, we have our own view of that, which we don't want to impose, but we tend more towards it being something human, invented by humans for humans, and that there may be other galaxies and other species who have developed something comparable to mathematics that might be totally different. We don't know, and we probably will never know. But Peter, against that background, please, I would say.
Sure. I mean, I think mathematics would probably work in almost any universe. Well, maybe not. That's a good thought. But so I'll misquote. I'm going to speak as an anthropologist here, because this is why this your presentation, the work is so riveting to me, because it kind of does what the essence of good anthropology does. And I'm going to misquote Claude Lévi-Strauss, very famous French anthropologist, who said, along with music and mathematics, anthropology is one of the great art forms. So we have mathematics, we have music, and we have anthropology. And I think and then one could also argue, and I think I got in trouble as a graduate student for arguing that, in fact, everything was a footnote to anthropology. But I don't think in this quest for finding zero, that is so far off the mark. And that's why I found it so fascinating. The fact that we're always trying to find access to these ineffable qualities when we look at our history as a people, as a civilization. What clues do we have? How do we build a world that, or access to a world that it has only left things for us in stories people tell, in carvings on stone, on sacred architecture? We have to go through this process in which we unpack that. And I think why this story to me is so fascinating, and we've discussed it sort of as a great vehicle or metaphor for doing a wonderful documentary. That's what I do as I segued from being an anthropologist through ethnographic film into purely documentary film, anthropology, ethnographic film, documentary film, science documentaries actually, is take a journey to try and recapitulate some of these kinds of wonderful discoveries. I just scribbled these notes, the ideas that, culture, philosophy, religion, archaeology, ethnography, all are bound together in trying to unpack this kind of wonderful introspection that we do as a species. I don't really have a solid question, except that I think the work is fascinating. Would you consider that the work at its core, in a sense, could be considered a kind of anthropological exploration? I did my field work in the Andes of South America. We were trying to get access to how, contemporary Andean people think, but also how did their precursors, the Incas, think when the Spanish arrived, as what happened in Cambodia, and the colonial powers took everything apart, reconstituted it. We had access to very strange things that had to be decoded, things called quipus, which were the way that the Andean people, the Incas, kept track of numbers. These knots tied on strings, we had to decode that, and it was an ingenious system, but it was a system that had been lost in time. So this idea of zero, I think, is again, it has a resonance. It's left something concrete. These quipus were found in tombs and graves that were not as ancient as what we're talking about here, but certainly were 15th, 16th, 14th century, artifacts that had to be decoded. The Spaniards had no idea what they were, but they little by little we found ways to decode them, and they were connected to all aspects of life and culture. And it gave us a sort of insight into an intellectual process that people who have long since deceased left as a legacy. So I think the work is spectacular. I'm very impressed by. I haven't read the book, and I'm absolutely going to. I have, I looked at the Google lecture. So yeah, anthropology, this quest towards ethnohistory. I think this is kind of a wonderful thing, and just your reflections a bit more on that confluence of culture, philosophy, religion, archaeology, all laying sort of bare pressure on trying to understand this kind of wonderful mathematical idea, which maybe is more metaphor than anything.
Well, Peter, you have deep insights into this from your own perspective, and I'm glad that you're showing this interest. We discussed it a little bit beforehand, but perhaps in future there may be something in it of getting together with the ladies and seeing what can be done to have some of this material recorded from your own your own unique perspective, which is, by the way, from what I understood, Miriam and you had both gone to University College in London. Is that correct?
Close. I was at Imperial College in London, so neighbors.
Okay.
I did my PhD work at the London School of Economics.
Okay.
So that's an interesting sort of confluence at this stage. But thanks a lot for that. Through the Zero Project, we're all in touch. So we'll put you in touch with Peter, with Debra and Miriam, and you can see where, if anything, it'll lead. And we'll be very keen to hear what comes out and be able to possibly report on it, especially where, again, it touches not on all these side issues, which are interesting, but especially on our own megalomaniacal search for the epicenter of zero. And that's where I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it. So thank you all very much for joining. It was very exciting. And speaking to the virtual audience, please join us the week after next to explore related issues to pinpoint, if possible, very, very, very much so, the zero's epicenter. We will then meet Professor Jim Ritter. Hold on to your hats. He's a historian of science and theoretical physicist at Sorbonne University. He will speak on ancient Mesopotamian mathematics, which is several thousand years older than what we've been talking about yet. And Professor Friedhelm Hoffmann of Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich in Germany, who will speak as specialist on ancient Egyptian mathematics. So there we have Mesopotamia, Egypt, China, India, and the Islamic world. And of course, Southeast Asia being part of that. And hopefully by putting all of our heads together, we might begin to discern some sort of a pattern, either of diffusion and transmission, or independent co-invention is always an option. And in that way, sort of inch closer to where we want to go about the invention of zero. So thank you very much. Until then.